Good afternoon. My name is David Wilcove, and I have the pleasure of both introducing today's speaker and welcoming you to the first seminar in the David Bradford Seminar Series here at the Center for Policy Research on Energy and the Environment, which is a new development within the Woodrow Wilson School and recognizes the growing interest within the school on issues pertaining to energy and environmental policy. I'm delighted to have you all here, and I'm especially delighted that we launched the seminar series with today's guest, Chris Golden. Chris is a professor of nutrition and planetary health at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard University. And I've been following Chris's career for a long time. In fact, I remember not too long after I arrived at Princeton, I read a magazine article about this remarkable high school student who was heading off, had spent time in Madagascar studying lemurs, and was now going to Harvard and intending to continue his research as an undergraduate on lemurs there. And I thought that was absolutely amazing. And I actually got in touch with Chris at that time in my heart of hearts, hoping that perhaps a few years hence he would want to come here for graduate school. At Harvard, he continued his research focusing on the hunting of lemurs for subsistence purposes in villages in Madagascar. And did not end up at Princeton, but went to Berkeley, where he continued his interest in lemur conservation, but he added at this point a very original and nuanced perspective, which was to not just consider what hunting is doing to lemur populations, which is an important question, but also ask what is lemur hunting doing to the people who hunt lemurs? That is to say, how important is the protein from lemurs in the diets of the rural communities where he was working, and how do their offtake rates of lemurs relate both to their health, but also the long-term sustainability of the lemur populations. Very original work with some very important findings. Now, that interest in the relationship between natural resources, human health, really has blossomed in the context of Chris's research in subsequent years. He's really driven now by a desire, I think, to understand the relationship between ecosystem services and human health, and not just in the context of hunting and bushmeat, but also increasingly fisheries management, agriculture, how all of these dependencies are changed as a function of population growth, climate change, deforestation, and he has kept his focus in particular on food insecure populations, typically people in rural areas, isolated regions, who depend on the natural environment for their sustenance, and in turn, those natural resources are affected not only by forces within the local people's control, but also forces outside their control. So it's really a fascinating interplay of ecology, epidemiology, and economics that involves both field work, clinical work, and modeling. And it is a real pleasure to welcome Chris Golden. Chris.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David, and for everyone for having me here. I want to thank you for the opportunity to present my research here to you today, which, as David mentioned, looks at the impacts of global wildlife declines on food security, nutrition, and health of people around the world. Planetary health explores the human health impacts of global environmental change, whether focusing on biodiversity, land use change like urbanization, the conversion of forest to fuel and firewood, fishery collapses, the conversion of rainforest to agricultural land, etc. And planetary health scientists are really interested in identifying and documenting and characterizing the ways in which ecosystem transformation has downstream effects on human health. The World Health Organization has estimated that around a quarter of the burden of disease could be avoided through improved ecosystem management. And so this, to me, presents this enormous opportunity for how we can improve the management of natural systems to actually improve human health as well. Throughout much of the developing world, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, many people rely on wildlife, often termed bushmeat. The world is facing the 6th mass extinction event, with global wildlife declines happening around the world, and none perhaps as dire as the one that's happening in Madagascar, where more than 90% of lemurs are threatened with extinction. And yet, excuse me, in the area where I live in northeastern Madagascar, more than 90% of that population actually rely on wildlife for food. Hundreds of millions of people around the world rely on wildlife for food, and these types of animal source foods, whether bushmeat, seafood, domesticated meats, all provide certain types of micronutrient nutrition, vitamins, and fatty acids that other types of foods just can't adequately supply, given the context of the places where these people live. And so these types of places are areas where fortified and biofortified foods are scarce, where supplementation is overly expensive, where people just don't have easy access to market foods, and also where people are exposed to infectious disease that leach micronutrients out of your body. And so these animal source foods become particularly important. All of my research can be captured under this kind of overall structure of wildlife and fish catch declines and how it impacts human micronutrient nutrition. Starting off looking at a certain type of wildlife population decline, how that leads to reduced access to animal source foods, how that then leads to micronutrient and vitamin intake decreases, and finally, based on the socio-cultural context or economic context of these places, it could lead to either an increased incidence of micronutrient deficiencies or an increased incidence of non-communicable diseases like metabolic disease, obesity, diabetes, etc. So what I'm going to do is walk you through 5 different studies. Most of these took place in Madagascar. On the left, 1, 2, and 3 are looking at rainforest mixed agricultural populations. That then provided this framework where I was able to adapt a lot of these same contexts to seafood-dependent populations in different parts of the world. So starting off first, as many of you know, Madagascar is the 4th largest island in the world. The Makira watershed, where I work, which is in this area of northeastern Madagascar, 50% of all of the floral biodiversity of Madagascar is found there. So in the Makira watershed, which is the Makira Natural Park to the west, Mashwala National Park to the east, nearly 1% of all of global floral biodiversity is estimated to be found there if you extrapolate rates of endemism and rates of biodiversity. So its conservation and biodiversity importance is quite clear. Madagascar is also a malnutrition hotspot. It's ranked 4th in terms of its level of stunting, which indicates an environment of chronic malnutrition, where the population is too short for its given age, and more than 50% of children are affected by stunting. It's also an anemia hotspot. So in the dark red, that means more than 40% of the population is affected by anemia. And in pre-adolescent children, which was the first population that I worked on, 62% of that population was affected by anemia. So before I go any further, I just want to mention that none of this work would be possible without the Maheri team. Maheri means strength in the local Malagasy language. It also stands for Madagascar Health and Environmental Research. And in addition to Ben Rice, who's here in the audience, sorry for blinding you with the laser, it is a team of Malagasy researchers and scientists, physicians, nurses, veterinarians from a broad array of disciplines who are really interested in tackling challenge-oriented research. And so this is something that I started in 2004 to begin a lot of the bushmeat research that I was doing in Madagascar. So to begin with this first study, which was my dissertation work, this was a prospective longitudinal cohort study. We enrolled 73 pre-adolescent children, followed them for 1 year, and on a daily basis measured all of the meat that they were consuming of any type of meat. These pre-adolescent children went in for clinical visits once per month and donated a blood sample for us to look at their hemoglobin status. And in that way, we were able to look at associations between wild food consumption and anemia. The environmental context is this. 15% of households in this area were consuming bats, around a quarter were consuming bush pig, 40% the native endemic carnivores, half of the population were eating lemurs, and more than 90% were eating these hedgehog-like animals called tenrecs. Recently, Kara Brooke is a recent Princeton grad that was working with Jess Metcalf and Andy Dobson, used data from the work that I had been doing in Madagascar to do a population viability analysis looking at the 11 different lemur species that were most commonly consumed. And as you can see, many of these populations really crash out, giving the hunting pressure on a very short time frame. And so there was this tension that arose between what people were eating and the stability and resilience of that nutritional resource base. And so my initial research showed that if you remove all of the wildlife from the diet and replace it with a vegetarian source foods, which was very likely given how prohibitively expensive domesticated meats are in this market, then you would expect a roughly 30% increase in the incidence of anemia within these poor populations. Now I'll move on to the second study, which is really just scaling up some of those preliminary ideas that we developed in the first study. We looked more broadly at wild food consumption and micronutrient nutrition and did a prospective cohort study with slightly more than 700 individuals and followed them for 15 months. I think the greatest success of this study was that we had 15 months of daily dietary intake data. So as you can see here, every breakfast, lunch, and dinner was recorded in 150 households, with every food item measured to the nearest gram prior to consumption. So as far as I know, this is the most detailed and precise long-term dietary database that exists. And so we have really neat dietary data that we can then link to a variety of nutritional and disease outcomes. So this study took place in 2013 and 2014, and in addition to all of the dietary data and social survey data, we also collected anthropometry to look at growth. We collected blood samples to look at a variety of different things. So this was nutritional analyses like iron, zinc, vitamin A, vitamin B12, fatty acid profiles, inflammation markers. Ben was able to do research looking at the genetics and genomics of malaria profiles. We also collected fecal samples to look at intestinal parasites. We collected breast milk samples, fingernail samples, to really generate these holistic health profiles to understand the roles of wild food in human nutrition. And this slide is the one that will surprise absolutely nobody in the audience who's familiar with Madagascar, which is that Malagasy people love rice. They eat more rice per person per day than any other group of people on Earth, and 75% of their diet is nutrition-less starch. So this is the rice, the yams, the cassava, the taro, the corn, that really is just dominating their diet. It's providing a ton of carbs, but it's really providing very little else. The remaining 25% is the animal source foods, the fruit and nuts, and the veg that really deliver micronutrients. Looking at this in another way in terms of dietary diversity, you can see that it's dominated by cereals and roots and tubers, and that you can also see that there are these spikes of purple, where they're getting these kind of infusions of high amounts of meat. And I'll show you why that happens, which is that the kind of holiday sacrifices. And so Christmas, New Year's, Easter, and again, for those of you not familiar with Madagascar, International Women's Day is a huge, huge party. So I recommend going there sometime in March if anyone can make it. Of the different types of meats that people are eating, more than 50% would be considered wild meats. Excuse me. So this is the bush meat, insects, and wild birds. And some households would eat upwards of 70 kilograms of wildlife, meaning roughly 12 quarter-pounder burgers of bush meat on a weekly basis for certain households. Yeah?
Why are they eating so little seafood? Is it island compared to eating bush meat?
They're inland, though. So this is in rainforest communities inland. Only maybe 7 to 12 kilometers inland, but still inland enough. If you kind of cross-multiply what people are eating by the nutrient composition of the foods they're eating, you can estimate what nutrients they might be deficient in. So you have the vitamin B12, D, calcium, vitamin A, etc., that would be severely deficient. You have vitamin C, zinc, and protein that would be deficient, and carbs, of course, doing perfectly fine. In addition to the nutritional profiles and nutritional data, we also collected the fecal samples. 33% were affected by Ascaris, 30% by hookworm, 12% by trichuris. All of these intestinal parasites, much like malaria, can leach nutrients out of the body and affect the relationship between dietary intake and nutritional status. Breast milk was collected to look at vertical transmission of nutrition, so from the mother to the child. And then we also are starting to characterize the microbiome of these individuals and look in the fingernails for contaminants and other things. In addition to all of the nutritional aspects of bushmeat consumption, there's also the disease dynamics of bushmeat consumption. So here, apologies for those that are still eating, you can see one of the hunters butchering a tenrec and that kind of blood-to-hand interaction, spit roasting an aye, butchering an aye, and yet we convinced all of the local hunter populations to actually, before they cook it, to put blood onto filter paper so that we could look for potential zoonotic pathogens. This became interesting because, as many of you might know, over the past several years there have been epidemic explosions of bubonic plague in Madagascar. 124 dead, nearly 1,200 infected. They say that this is the largest epidemic of bubonic plague since the Middle Ages. And this to me was very interesting because Yersinia pestis, which is the disease-causing agent of the plague, is known to kind of rifle through rodent populations with only 20% survivorship. However, with tenrecs can actually host Yersinia pestis and never die. And so it can constantly spill over into the population. So this unique animal in Madagascar is actually what is propagating this explosion of the plague. And tenrecs make up 70% of wildlife consumed by biomass. So we started a mark recapture project with these little guys, captured them in cages, collected ectoparasites like fleas, which is the vector for Yersinia pestis, collected raw blood in RNeasy tubes, put antennae on their back so that we could track where they were going and look at how the home ranges overlapped with communities to try to understand some of these dynamics. And now permit me to go on somewhat of a tangent right now. This is one of the more interesting papers that I've written. It is a mapping of the religious cosmology of the local Betsimisarka ethnic group. From left to right, you see evil to good. From bottom to top, you see the kind of power of the actors, and so humans are the least powerful, followed by the kind of respected elders, spiritual mediums, and then going into the spiritual pantheon and the ancestors. And here, the Kalanuru is one of the ones that is particularly interesting and important. This is the Kalanuru. The Kalanuru is always envisioned in the same way throughout all of Madagascar. She's a dwarf with very, very long hair, long fingernails, and backwards-facing feet, so that when she runs away from you, you think she's going the other way, and you can never find her. However, she will appear in visions, and so the way that people get taboos in Madagascar is by several different ways, but the two primary ones are through parental inheritance. Both the mother and the father will give their children their taboos, but you can also have a vision from the Kalanuru to give you a taboo. And almost all of these are related to different types of food consumption. So for many years, I collected the stories that related to these different taboos and quantified them at household levels. And you can see that the hedgehog tenrec is right at the top, with more than 50% of the population being affected by this taboo. When looking at the stories and qualitatively looking at them, I realized that there was this traditional epidemiological knowledge that was really based within this culture. Almost all of the stories had to do with zoonotic pathogens, with toxins, or with allergies. And it became really, really interesting to me, whether it was peanuts or taro leaves or different types of mushrooms or the hedgehog tenrec as it relates to the bubonic plague, or flying foxes or eels, which have the largest kind of likelihood of passing on chiguatera of any sort of marine species. And so it became very interesting to me to try to dissect this. This is, of course, not causative research that I've done, but more speculative, but I think it's very fascinating. And it also ties in with the Malagasy worldview. The Malagasy worldview is such that they believe that they're standing in the middle of a circle with their children and grandchildren behind them, with their ancestors in front of them, because very logically, the only thing that they can see is what has already happened, the history. And so they believe that they are facing their history with that full knowledge and list of events and walking backwards into an unknown future. And so what really strikes me about that is the elements that link to kind of our Western view of science and how obsessed we are with observation and patterns and how to then derive those patterns into what we would call theories, but they have kind of cultural stories and histories. Moving on to our final study in Madagascar, looking at ecological, economic, and sociocultural drivers of nutrition and disease. This is in partnership with Jess Metcalf and Ben Rice, and you can see that that is very much a non-photoshopped traditional Betsileo hat that Jess is wearing. And Ben, who actually led all of the field research in Madagascar for well over a year. And we worked in 4 different regions throughout Madagascar, all based at Catholic Relief Services sites. So we worked in the High Plateau, which is a mountainous and cold region, in the west-southwest and south-southwest, which are both kind of dry, almost spiny desert areas, and then also in the southeast, which is a rainforest area. So trying to cover various dimensions of ecological dynamics, where we kind of stratified our sample into peri-urban and urban settlements, 50 households per community, 24 total sites, so 6 per different region, for a total of 1,200 households and almost 6,000 individuals. So we used the exact same sampling protocols as we did in past cohort studies. So we have all of that kind of different blood and fun fecal matter back in the States now, and we will be doing analyses on this. This is all just to mention that this has just finished, but I look forward to coming back and hanging out with David, Jen, Jess, Ben, and others. So before I completely shift gears, I was just going to play all of you a brief video. This video kind of ties a bow on some of the research that we've been doing and goes into the intervention aspects of what we've been doing in Madagascar. So I wanted to show you that just to kind of transport you into the locations where I'm working, because sometimes it's very hard to envision that. And this is one of the more, I would say, almost peri-urban villages where we work. Give me 1 second just to reload this. Pardon?
How come they don't grow soybeans as well as rice? Is that an option?
I've never seen soybeans in Madagascar, have you? So now we're completely switching gears and we're moving into a project looking at kind of a global, very rough level scale at global fish declines and micronutrient nutrition. What made me think of these things was all of these newspaper headlines that I was seeing. The world is running out of fish. Death of coral reefs could devastate nations. Global warming could cause fishing to decline by millions of tons each year. All of these things really got me thinking, to what extent is this issue that I was looking at in Madagascar, looking at bushmeat and food security, really a smaller microcosm which was happening at a much larger and more global scale with regard to wild-caught fisheries. So I ended up applying for a grant to the Wellcome Trust, putting together a team of very diverse kind of scientific interests, whether it's ecosystem services, epidemiology, complex systems modeling, climate scientists, geographers, economists, to really try to understand the interaction between one form of climate change, which is sea temperature rise, seafood production, access to seafood, and human nutrition. So basically, this very basic schematic is looking at how we could actually quantify declining fish catch, link it to people's consumption of alternative foods that would lead to some sort of dietary change, how that would present some form of nutritional vulnerability, and whether or not technological innovations like aquaculture or more grassroots approaches like changes in fisheries management could actually help to improve human health outcomes. Focusing first on declining fish catch, we harness data from the Sea Around Us program. Just by a show of hands, how many people are familiar with that? All right, I'm going to do the basics then. So the Sea Around Us program was based at the University of British Columbia. It was a project where they spent 15 years working in every coastal nation across the earth to reconstruct fish catch in 4 sectors: industrial, artisanal, subsistence, and recreational, for each fish species across 1950 to the present. And so this data set allowed us to do the type of work that we did to understand what fish were kept locally for consumption, which ones entered into the market and left internationally, and then also to adapt certain types of climate models. This is work done by William Chung and his group at UBC to understand where fish are going. So sea temperature rise is going to drive fish polewards. It's also going to deoxygenate the water, which will cause fish to be smaller, which will cause their grouping patterns to be smaller as well. And so if you look at total fish catch all along this equatorial belt, it's anticipated to decline by roughly 50% by 2050. And so for me as a public health specialist, I see these areas in red as the ones that we are most concerned about from a food security perspective, from a governance perspective, from a corruption of the seas perspective, et cetera. And so it's really worrisome that there seems to be this kind of perfect storm of climate change, inadequate governance, food insecurity, and a lot of changing global dynamics when it comes to increasing nationalism. So if people are losing access to seafood, what are they then eating? My very, very, very basic answer to that, because this is the most complicated question that we try to deal with quantitatively, is no matter what it is, it's worse than fish. And so fish is kind of nature's superfood. It is super high in fatty acids, in iodine, vitamin D, iron, zinc, vitamin B12. Everything that is good for you is found in fish. And so no matter what they are moving to, by nature, it is going to be something that is less desirable from a strictly nutritional perspective. And so what types of dietary changes would then occur if people are losing access to seafood? We characterize this by having 3 different typologies. There will be the unaffected wealthy nations. This is places like the US, Japan, New Zealand, where a local collapse of fish stocks might lead to some slight price shifts in the market or to maybe some species shifting. But for all intents and purposes, those who were consuming fish beforehand will continue to. Those who were not eating seafood beforehand will continue to, and not much would change from a health impact standpoint. There would then be countries where increasing undernutrition would occur. This is places like Madagascar, Gabon, Suriname, where a collapse of the local fisheries would be quite devastating. It would move people into more rice, more tubers, more veg diets, less domesticated meats because those might be prohibitively expensive. And so increasing micronutrient deficiencies. There's then an interesting case, which is our third case, of the acceleration of the nutrition transition. This would be places like Indonesia, the Philippines, Mexico, Brazil, the small island developing states of the Pacific, where a collapse of local fisheries would lead people into these cheap market alternatives, fast food, frozen pizzas, ramen, this kind of quote-unquote Western diet, leading people into metabolic disease, diabetes, obesity, etc. And we've already seen this starting to take place. And so how does this then present a nutritional vulnerability? We mapped this on the undernutrition side, so not on the kind of nutrition transition side in a recent paper. And we showed that there were hotspots where the dark blue, which is the high fish declines, overlapped with the dark orange, which is where the nutritional risk and vulnerability is highest. So Central and West Africa and Southeast Asia seem to be particular hotspots where we are anticipating some sort of conflict with seafood declines and nutritional security happening in the imminent future. And so where do we go from here? Remember the statistic of the kind of people that work on the global burden of disease saying that around 1/4 could actually be avoided through improved ecosystem management. My main message here, I have several kind of controversial things that I will always say in my talk, but aquaculture is insufficient. Aquaculture outpaced wild capture fisheries several years ago, and yet the way that aquaculture is currently oriented from a policy framework is insufficient to address the needs of food insecurity in the developing world. In taking the 40 most nutritionally vulnerable countries on Earth, we divided them into 3 different categories of how they produce and use aquaculture. The countries in red produce little to no aquaculture at all, and because of the types of countries that they are, they're not going to receive aquaculture products through the market. No one is going to be kind of producing expensive forms of aquaculture and then sending it to Libya. That's just not in our kind of economic structure. So they're not going to benefit from aquaculture. There's then the countries in yellow, which produce quite a bit of aquaculture, but it is nearly all export oriented. And so again, the way in which people locally would benefit from that would be that there are economic benefits derived that then somehow benefit nutritionally vulnerable people. Again, this is a fairly unlikely case, given that the majority of the people producing this aquaculture for export are large corporations. Finally, there are the countries in green that are producing a lot of aquaculture, and it is retained domestically. So this is kind of the bright spot of where this could actually benefit nutritional outcomes. However, when looking at the kind of nuances of what actually happens in these domestic markets, many times all of the aquaculture floods into urban city markets. It is more of a luxury good that's going to wealthier families. And so really the main message here is that if aquaculture is going to benefit nutritionally vulnerable people, it needs to be designed that way from the outset. There are bright spots in places like Cambodia and Bangladesh where they've developed these kind of joint fish, rice farming systems where it was designed to be pro-poor, gender equal, pro-nutrition. And in that way, it really does succeed in serving those types of needs. But the way that it is designed now, I don't think will be successful. In addition to aquaculture, we also need to consider improvements in fisheries management. Roughly 60% of fisheries are either overexploited or fully collapsed, and another 35% are fully exploited. And so we need to reframe fisheries management to again be nutritionally oriented, to be nutritionally sensitive, so that we allow fisheries a chance to recover, they can rebuild their populations, and in and of themselves could become a nutritional intervention if we can sustainably harvest them and allow that product to flow to local communities. And so an ideal shift in the system dynamics would be to have nutrition-sensitive aquaculture, to have nutrition and climate-smart fisheries management, which would then increase fish catch, leading to strengthening of resilient food systems, leading to positive dietary change, which would ultimately lead to nutritional security. That's kind of very high-level, fuzzy global thinking with data that doesn't always map perfectly onto it. So we really wanted to dial in and look at seafood consumption and micronutrient nutrition in one specific context. So working exactly adjacent, and as Denise mentioned, kind of our prior sites were about 7 to 10 kilometers inland. This was immediately adjacent, so very similar culturally, but very different labor activities. So these were the rainforest villages. Here were then 5 villages that we studied over the course of 3 years in a study that just finished this past December. Same procedures as the original cohort study, but in addition to all of the nutritional and dietary intake data, we also collected weekly fish catch data and also did underwater visual census to look at the health of reefs and the abundance of reef fisheries. And we stratified this by 3 different types of management systems. This is, of course, not an adequate sample size to actually look at any of these things in a meaningful way, but we did what we could with the existing budget. But there are 3 different types of management systems present in the Antangiel Bay. The strictest is Marine National Park. This is something that is managed by the government. It is a strict no-take zone in certain areas, and only that community that lives there is allowed to fish there. Then there is co-managed areas or locally managed marine areas where there is co-management between Wildlife Conservation Society and the local communities. That's kind of a mid-tier in terms of strictness, where other communities are allowed to go in and fish, but it is regulated by the community themselves, and they can block certain people from using certain types of gear with the aim of increasing the productivity of the fishery. And finally, traditional management, which just means that the community's traditions for managing this are not affected by the government or by any NGOs. And so what we're hoping to do is to use these types of data to understand how different types of fisheries management can improve access to seafood and improve nutritional outcomes. So something I want to show you here that complicates all of this kind of ability for locals to manage this is from Global Fish Watch. How many people are familiar with Global Fish Watch? So this is the ability to look at all AIS, which is their satellite tracking systems for all sea vessels. So you can see here the lights going over on this time. Oop, did I stop that? Sorry. Not going to use the laser at the same time. But you can see all of the lights. These are potentially fishing vessels that are going in all other parts of Madagascar. You can see these light blue lines, which indicate the exclusive economic zone. So this one is for Madagascar. And then you also have the ability, using Global Fish Watch, to track certain vessels of where they're coming and where they're going and what types of kind of sailing patterns they're doing. So you can see here from Réunion, you have shipping vessels that are going into the East Coast, collecting all of the tuna, bringing it back to Réunion, shipping it out to France, going into Madagascar, collecting all of the tuna, bringing it back, making money, no benefits going to local communities, stealing all of their local resources. And so it presents these really interesting kind of environmental justice, social justice issues of how countries rent out their EEZs to foreign nations, what types of benefits should be expected by local communities for actually managing their natural systems and their coastal resources when there are issues like this at hand. There's another case of what marine conservation should do. So we are just about to launch a project next month in Kiribati in the South Pacific. So you can see here kind of the entire EEZ for Kiribati. This in the red is the new Phoenix Island Protected Area, which was the largest marine protected area until Palau just did theirs. And so you can see that I really can't touch the laser, huh? Sorry, everyone. Prior to it being gazetted as a national park, you can see all of the fishing vessels inside, and then once it is gazetted, you can see all of the fishing vessels move outside. And so there is this ability for marine conservation to have these very specific actions on the behaviors of international actors in foreign fishing waters, and then allow fish a chance to recover, where the increased reproduction and productivity of the fisheries could then be going toward local communities.
How do they enforce those boundaries?
They don't enforce those boundaries very well. So Kiribati, in addition to 23 other nations and territories, is part of something called the Secretariat of the Pacific Community. And so they have a navy, but the individual countries do not. So it's impossible for them to police this.
But it's remarkable that you just don't see those ships there now.
They know that their satellite is being tracked.
That's an enforcement mechanism.
And so it is a type of enforcement mechanism. There's, of course, sketchy things that people can do. So in Ghana, it'll be 49% Chinese-owned vessel, 51% Ghanaian-owned vessel, so that it looks like it's them that's fishing, and other ways of kind of turning on and off your AIS. But in general, I think it will have a strong policy impact. Yes?
Do you see redistribution of fishing effort then, just at the boundaries as it increases?
That's interesting. So even just having these types of policies, it might actually switch certain types of countries to be fishing in other countries' EEZs just based on this. And so it's something that's very newly being studied but hasn't been looked at carefully. It's a great question, though. And so we just got funding from NSF, the Coupled Human Natural Systems, to start a 4-year project in Kiribati to look at how management of coral reef systems would actually impact the nutritional status and potentially either lead to a deceleration or acceleration of the nutrition transition. Kiribati is a really interesting country. There are 32 different islands, and they're all relatively independent and isolated. And so you can look at their different governance systems for the reefs, you can look at the level of market integration, and you can look at the quality of their reefs and determine the kind of ways in which management of reefs leads to differential access to seafood, and with kind of market integration as a moderating factor, look at how different types of nutritional outcomes may occur. Yes?
Previous screen, does that limit the fish catch, or does that just redistribute how the fish are being caught?
So it doesn't change the quotas or limits in terms of what people are allowed to catch, but it would change that based on certain types of species. So different types of kind of reef-dependent species might be protected by that type of protected area. It wouldn't necessarily for some of the larger migratory species, but as I mentioned in my last comment, I think that some of this might actually displace effort from Kiribati as a country to somewhere else where there's going to be less regulation. So it's not globally good news, but there are ways where nations can have good news. And so with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone, David for having me, Jess and Amy and Ben for being wonderful collaborators, and all of you for listening.
Thank you very much. We have time for some questions, and Chris, I'll let you direct the question.
Okay, great. I see one.
Comparison with different marine resource management in Madagascar, is there a way for you to know whether the no-take zone applies to the other areas?
Say it again, I'm sorry.
Is there a way for you to know whether fish from the no-take zone are buffering exploitation in the other marine management areas?
It's a great question and something we're not able to look at, but that is what people will theorize. Yes?
When you were showing the nutritional deficiencies in the first part, I was trying to read the protein. Was protein deficient? That seemed to be close to okay.
Protein was close to okay.
And so really, is micronutrient deficiencies the key issue?
Absolutely. This is one of the things that I always try to discuss, even though it's such a kind of basic aspect of nutritional research, but people tend to misunderstand the importance of protein. Across the board, in most diets around the world, if you have sufficient calories, which we don't in this case, you always have sufficient protein. So if you are eating enough food, you're getting your protein. It's not of a concern. The reason why this becomes complicated is most people call meats proteins. You go to a fancy restaurant, they ask you what kind of protein you're interested in. Meats and proteins have very little to do with each other from a nutritional perspective in terms of their importance. The true importance of animal source foods is in their delivery of micronutrients, vitamins, and fatty acids.
So is there an alternative there? I mean, I'm going back to your first situation. If they're relying on bushmeat, there's no solution, right? They can't eat more. They're already depleting it. You're not going to go out and produce more bushmeat
Right.
by eating more bushmeat. So the only alternative is either produce a bunch of chickens domestically,
Right.
or find some alternatives. And what's your view on the kind of the various alternatives?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that two things need to occur simultaneously. One, reducing the infectious disease burden could do a lot for nutritional status in the first place. The second thing that you can do is just improve and increase the overall amount of food that's available. Because a lot of those stark deficiencies you're seeing is not just because you're lacking meats, but it's because you just don't have enough food, period. They're eating roughly 1,700 calories per day, and these people are working incredibly difficult agricultural labor, so it's just purely not enough calories. So there's not enough food. And so I think if you increase that, reduce the infectious disease burden, the chicken intervention becomes quite positive and plausible for its impact in having small amounts of animal source foods that would be needed. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't want to monopolize, but the fatty acid issue, which it doesn't get much discussion.
Mm-hmm.
How critical is that to some of the health? Do you have an opinion of how critical that is to the health effects you're seeing, and are there substitutes for that?
It's a great question. It's a hot area of research in nutrition right now, and the kind of best answer is that there are no robust RCTs that have been done on fatty acids to know the exact kind of dimensions of impacts like you do for iron, zinc, vitamin B12, et cetera. And so they expect that it has a lot to do with cognitive and motor development. They expect that it has a lot to do with neural development at early stages, but there is no rich body of evidence that has looked at that sufficiently.
Maybe you need a new program or oilseed. I mean, other
Yeah.
than fish, I mean, you're going to have to.
Or seaweed. I mean, seaweed's the one place where you can actually get omega-3s in any useful way. But that might be a harder sell in terms of cultural adoption in some places.
Well, maybe the question is, I have in the back of my mind from years ago, something about adding micronutrients to grains.
Mm-hmm.
Is that an avenue for this?
That's absolutely possible. So there are a lot of evidence of showing kind of vitamin A enriched sweet potatoes or golden rice, which is an iron enriched rice. The problem in many of those contexts is it changes the agricultural requirements of how you have to kind of raise and harvest that, and also changes the taste dimensions. And so as anyone knows who's been to Madagascar, they kind of have a very, very specific nose and taste for rice. And I worry that that might not be a successfully adopted intervention. And I think that we also underestimate to what extent we really need to provide a holistic group of micronutrients to people, and not just kind of one-offs that can actually disrupt natural biogeochemistries. And so I would worry about kind of infusing iron, infusing zinc, because a lot of those things are +2 cations. When you kind of improve iron, it might reduce the number of spaces for zinc or magnesium or calcium, et cetera. And so it becomes more complicated when you're not using a whole food or dietary approach. And so I think that's why many people try to opt for this more kind of dietary diversification approach. Yeah.
Chris, I was curious, the introduction of chicken into your study area in Madagascar was for a long time bedeviled by the Newcastle disease problem,
Yep.
which was ultimately largely resolved with a vaccine. Would that vaccine have occurred absent your team's involvement in it? Which is to say, are the folks in the veterinary world, agricultural world who are developing these things, do they pay attention to these sorts of situations where, globally speaking, a relatively small number of people are affected, but there's also a huge biodiversity issue on top of the human suffering?
So, a couple answers to that question. One, people have been working on Newcastle disease for a long time. It's something that just had an outbreak in California recently. And so the types of vaccines that have been developed have been ongoing for a very long time, but they've been developed in such a way that don't fit with the type of constraints that are in these kind of rural, remote areas of Madagascar. So the novelty of the vaccine that we developed with Imvavet was that it is thermostable, and so it has a kind of 2-week chain where it doesn't need to be refrigerated or frozen, which allows you to access some of these more remote areas. And the other novelty is that all of the other vaccines are injectables, which are very, very difficult for non-specialists to do without killing the birds. And so ours is an eyedropper, where you just put it right into the eye, which anyone can be trained to do successfully. And so it was more about adapting existing technologies rather than kind of doing something. So That's one answer to your question. The other is I don't think it's on their radar to do these types of things. I think a lot of it is through commercial development for kind of money-making prospects.
So food insecure rural people are going to be the last in the list to benefit from these sorts of breakthroughs that tend to go to the large agricultural operations.
Yep. And just to also clarify, we didn't bring chickens in there. Chickens is something that has been in Madagascar for a very, very long time. And we kind of chose them very specifically because, as I mentioned with the taboo research, nobody has a taboo for chickens. Economically, it seemed like a good idea because they are more expensive than bushmeat, but are more preferred by taste. And so if we can increase the production, it could decrease the price and kind of wean people away from bushmeat and move them in to chickens. Yes?
What fraction of the land in Madagascar is used for farming or agriculture?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to it. I'm sorry. There's a lot of open land that isn't being used for farming right now, but any of the open land that has water adjacent to it without technology, I would say is all being used for farming right now. So it would require a certain amount of investment and technology to develop arable land in existing spaces. It's a place with 25 million people in the size of Texas that's still growing at over 3% per year. And so a lot of these questions are becoming more and more pressing over time.
Last question.
Yep.
Are there projections regarding the global forest transition in relation to the nutrition transition, in terms of impoverishment of forest and all these?
I think so I'm not specifically working on that, but I know that there's a lot of people thinking about that. I was just part of a meeting that was being led by Terry Sunderland and there's someone's name from UBC that I'm not going to remember, but they're leading something right now to see to what degree they can do global level mapping of forest cover, forest composition, and actually tree species composition to understand the parallels between nutrition and the type of dietary diversity that can be provided by forests.
Chris, thank you so much for a fascinating seminar.
Thanks.